that I was a bit surprised that this is now. Respected Master, President, Registrar, members of the Council and the Board of the Senate of Serampore College, dear bishops and principals, heads of the institutions, students and graduates, and brothers and sisters in Christ. It is great honor and indeed a privilege for me to be invited by this body first to receive an honorary degree in theologically and then to speak to this assembly. I feel humbled by this recognition of my contribution to the mission of God in cooperation with some of you. You invited me to choose myself a topic of relevance to the Church and to theological education in particular, and I decided to go back to a theme which has accompanied me during all my journey. It is spiritual and mental growth. I have described my journey in the written text. I will skip it here for time reasons, but I would just like to make this remark to explain why I chose this topic. You see, usually when we talk about spiritual growth, we consider growth as more. Pray more, give more, serve more, but that is just quantitative growth. And the concept I would like to share with you today is a concept of the growth of the personality while we go through the ages of our lives. And that is another concept of spiritual growth. And I would like to share that with you today. Let me start with an anecdote. When I came to the Central African Republic in 1981, I was surprised by the low level of education in the country as well as in the church. I should not have been surprised, I learned later, because this country had come into contact with the outside world as late as 1900. The area where I worked saw the first missionaries in 1930. That was only 50 years ago then. The students I met had never left their country, had only a rudimentary knowledge of the French language in which I was going to teach. They were not able to use a dictionary. They knew no world atlas and had never heard of human rights, of the world market, or even contraceptive methods or bank accounts. They knew the Bible pretty well, but the knowledge that would have helped them to put the biblical message in context was extremely weak. While I was still struggling to adapt to the situation, I was approached by another group of young people who asked me to do something for them. They were students from the area's high school who were either going to graduate soon or who had fallen out of school a few years before graduation, sometimes because of bad grades, sometimes because of lack of support. I learned then that these young people were excluded from the seminary where I was teaching because they had not gone through the church's Bible school first and had not worked as catechists before applying for a place in the seminary. When I asked them why they would not go to that Bible school, they said, look, many students in the Bible school learn how to read and write when they come. And what they then learn is very basic. We have done some studies at high school, and we feel humiliated when we have to go there. Besides, it will be a loss of time. The church leaders to whom I talked about this confirmed what the young people said. They will only be big-headed when they are pastors. What we need is humble servants and not smart young people who ask questions and refuse to obey. The way we do it is indeed a test of humility to them. It took 7 years to come to terms with the problem. What helped was the fact that many of the high school students were in some way related to the church leaders. Some were their children. Also, the church was more and more getting in contact with international partners and seeing its lack of skills. In 1988, the seminary abolished the rule that candidates would have to go through the Bible school first, and a batch of students with a much better basic education was taken. Today, the church is entirely led by local people. The president and all the teachers at the Bible school and the seminary, 2 with a Doctor of Theology degree, are of the group of students who benefited from the change in 1988. I will come back to that anecdote later. From those early days, I have been reflecting on the relationship between the generations, not only in the church, but in the society as a whole. I would like to share with you a reading experience which inspired my thinking and my work. It is James W. Fowler's Stages of Faith. I am often surprised that in discussions about development, there is much talk about economics, technology, power relations, political parameters, laws, but very little thought is given to the question where the people who are supposed to develop or to do development stand in the development of their personality. Fowler helped me to become aware of this question, and I am thankful for this opportunity to bring his concept back to attention. I'm skipping a short passage. Before I describe the stages of faith according to Fowler, let me explain that Fowler has a very broad understanding of faith. Faith is a universal human concern. Prior to our being religious or irreligious, before we come to think of ourselves as Catholics, Protestants, Jews, or Muslims, we are already engaged with faith issues. Whether we become non-believers, agnostics, or atheists, we are concerned with how to put our lives together and with what we will make life worth living. Moreover, we look for something to love that loves us, something to value that gives us value, something to honor and respect that has the power to sustain us. In other words, the question for Fowler is not what we believe, but how we believe. Our way of believing changes as we grow, and people of all faiths go through these stages. Now let us look at the stages, and especially at those of concern for our question, that is, how we move from one generation to the next. Mythic literal faith typically takes form in the elementary school years. It is marked by 2 characteristics. One is the ability to narrate. A 10-year-old is able to tell coherent stories and to understand those which others tell. This capacity for and interest in narrative makes the school-age child particularly attentive to the stories that concern the origins and formative experience of the familial and communal groups to which he or she belongs. The limit is this: with further development, we will later construct the ability to step back from our stories, reflect upon them, and to communicate their meanings by way of more abstract and general statements. Stage 2 does not yet do this. The other ability is a sense of justice based on reciprocity. This sense can express itself in excessively simple terms of strict reciprocity, invariably sending bad fortune to bad people and sending good fortune to the virtuous. But it can also emerge into the fairness of instrumental exchange, where whatever one person is entitled to, each other person is also entitled to. Fowler relates an interesting interview with a woman in her 50s, which shows that the step from one stage to the next is not done by every believer. What she says about prayer shows the strong sense for reciprocity. I have my children, she says. I say, build up your bank account. And when you sit in the dentist chair and it goes, oh, you just say, open the bank, and out it pours, and it works. If you get in a mess, you have that bank, and it will open up, and it will help you through the mess. Fowler summarizes the strengths and weaknesses of stage 2. The strength is the rise of narrative and the emergence of story, drama, and myth as ways of finding and giving coherence to experience. The limitations of literalness and an excessive reliance upon reciprocity can result either in an over-controlling, stilting perfectionism or works righteousness, or in their opposite, an abasing sense of badness because of mistreatment, neglect, or the apparent disfavor of significant others. The factor initiating transition to stage 3 is the implicit clash or contradiction in stories that leads to reflection of meanings. The transition to formal operational thought makes such reflection possible and necessary. With the last sentence, Fowler brings in Piaget's concept of mental development and refers to the ability to think scientifically, which develops from the age of 12. From that age on, children ask more and more whether what they are told is possible. They develop a critical mind and start seeing the discrepancies between different narratives. This ability brings joy to every teacher of biology and chemistry because the children start researching themselves. But this ability brings misery to every pastor and priest because children no more believe every word they are told. Stage 3, synthetic conventional faith. Puberty brings with it a revolution in physical and emotional life. Young people become aware of themselves as individuals and of the fact that they are seen by others. This brings contradiction into their lives, while they become more and more critical in the sense that they test what they are told. They become also more and more aware of the expectations of others. Peer pressure develops, but also their desire to be looked upon favorably by persons of authority. Authority is located externally to the self. Fowler does not deny that adolescents make choices or that they develop strong feelings and commitments regarding their values and behavioral norms. However, despite their genuine feelings of having made choices and commitments, a truer reading is that their values and self-images, mediated by the significant others in their lives, have largely chosen them. A person in stage 3 is aware of having values and normative images. He or she articulates them, defends them, and feels deep emotional investments in them. But typically, this person has not made the value system as a system the object of reflection. One important aspect of this tacit value system is the use of symbols. They are organically and irreplaceably tied to the full realities of their meaning systems. Said another way, the symbols are not separable from the what they symbolize. Fowler summarizes, the emergent capacity of the stage is the forming of a personal identity and faith. But the expectations and evaluations of others can be so compellingly internalized and sacralized that later autonomy of judgment and action can be jeopardized. Factors contributing to the breakdown of stage 3 into readiness for transition may be the encounter with experience or perspectives that lead to critical reflection on how one's beliefs and values have formed and changed, and on how relative they are to one's particular group or context. Frequently, the experience of leaving home, emotionally or physically, or both, precipitates the kind of examination of self, background, and life-guiding values that gives rise to stage transition at this point. We already saw an example of an adult who remained in stage 2 for the rest of her life. Now Fowler observes that stage 3 typically has its rise and ascendancy in adolescence, but for many adults it becomes a permanent place of equilibrium. It is a conformist stage in the sense that it is acutely tuned to the expectations and judgments of significant others, and as yet does not have a sure enough grasp on its own identity and autonomous judgment to construct and maintain an independent perspective. Again, we realize that the passage from one stage to the next is not made by all. Stage 4, individuative, reflective faith. The description of the previous stages and the name of this one almost speak for themselves. For a genuine move to stage 4, there must be an interruption of reliance on external sources of authority. The tyranny of the they, or the potential for it, must be undermined. Their expectations are submitted to a personal choice of what is right or wrong. Fowler calls this the emergence of an executive ego. That does not mean at all that other people are lost out of sight. In the contrary, the individuative, reflective faith becomes genuinely aware of social systems and institutions. It achieves an understanding of social relations in systems terms. In other words, the group of people out of which one comes and to which one belongs becomes less important, while the concern for society or even humanity as a whole grows. The development of critical potential of this stage does not stop before the symbols of faith. The believer can now distinguish between a symbol and its meaning. In face of liturgical ritual or a religious symbol, the individuative, reflective person asks, but what does it mean? If the symbol or symbolic act is truly meaningful, its meanings can be translated into propositions, definitions, and/or conceptual foundations. This brings also losses. The coziness of the original community makes place to a colder, more reflective environment, not to speak about the critical questions from the side of family and members of the community which one leaves or considers as less important. The naive assurance of belief makes place for a more reflective approach, but it also means a demythologization which hurts. This stage is a time of inner conflicts, but also of liberation of the self. Paula summarizes, stage 4's strength has to do with its capacity for critical reflection on identity and outlook. It's dangerous in its strengths, an excessive confidence in the conscious mind and in critical thought and a kind of narcissism. Stage 5 looms at the horizon, but we will leave Fowler here. If we were in a classroom now, this would be the time for group work. We would exchange views on whether we made steps in our lives which would fit into the picture, whether we tried to avoid them or whether we welcomed them, whether we were encouraged to move on or whether we were discouraged. Where would each one of us see himself or herself in the picture? How was it to move away from home and go to college? We might also discuss our roles in the game. Depending on where we are, which place we have, we will look at the whole system differently. Are we an educator? Are we a student who just graduated? Are we bishops? We might also, and I might add that we might also read the newspaper together and try to see whether this stages model could be applied to certain themes we read in the newspaper. God Vapsi, what would that be in this picture? Where would we place that? And if we talk about God Vapsi, we have also to talk about churches who claim that by 2020 they want to have established one church in every single Indian village. Which stage of faith would that represent? So there would be many possibilities to play with this system and to try to apply it to our lives and also to the life of our society. Now, before we apply Fowler's concept to the lives of our churches and our societies, I want to put out an important warning. It is obvious that the stages of faith mean the personal development of people with whom we live. And there is a strong risk of becoming judgmental. It must be avoided at any price to classify people according to the stage they live in. This is the reason, by the way, why many people do not like the concept. On the other hand, as educators, we cannot avoid the question where our students stand in their development. On the contrary, it is for their personal development that they come to us. I often put it this way: when you work with people, you have to do two things at the same time. You have to give people the feeling and the assurance that they are totally acceptable and accepted as they are. And at the same time, you have to see what they can become and help them become what they can become. My focus today is not on the guided, it is on the guides. For we have seen that in the stages 2 and 3, people can be particularly vulnerable to seduction. The danger is that the particular weaknesses of the stages are abused of. A lady who sees her prayers as down payments in a bank account is vulnerable to preachers who encourage her to pay real money to her church in a bank account and wait for the return on her investment. There are large Neo-Pentecostal churches in Latin America whose leaders thrive on this strategy. The strong sense of reciprocity of stage 2 is at the origin of never-ending chains of violence and retaliation in armed conflicts between large groups. People who are caught within the narrative of their community, their culture, or their religion are a treasure for political leaders because they will defend the true narrative against all who adhere to other narratives or against all who put into question the value of authoritative narratives altogether. Young people whose sense of value comes from the belonging to a larger community of which they are a part, and who are afraid of the uncertainty which comes with leaving the community's value system in stage 3, are useful for political leaders because they can manipulate them more easily than critical and self-reflecting people. Communalism is also a psychological fact. People who do not see the difference between symbols and what they symbolize will be ready to defend the symbols of their community at any price, and also to destroy the symbols of the others. They would take down buildings if they have to. Uniforms symbolizing the they play an important role in such movements. Excuse me. Sorry. The abasing sense of badness embraced because of mistreatment, neglect, or the apparent disfavor of significant others, which comes out of a non-satisfied sense of reciprocity, may be at the origin of much violence and even suicide attacks. All these examples point to one particular problem, and that is the delay in the passage from one stage to the next. As I pointed out, no one will accuse an individual person of not moving ahead. But what if leaders deliberately plan to keep people from moving ahead in the development of their personality? Because that is in fact a possibility. The leaders of a Neo-Pentecostal church in Brazil who fare quite well on the income from the down payments of their believers will do everything to keep them in their thinking. They will demonize critics and make sure nobody goes for theological studies except in their own schools. Traditional and also religious leaders will make their flock utterly afraid of the uncertainties that come with leaving the community and opening up for the modern world. They will exert social control and threaten those who dare move ahead. In some countries, there is a tendency to review the history books used in school in order to keep the national or cultural narrative intact and to shelter it from critical research. Russia is one example where this is presently happening. I shared with you the anecdote at the beginning of my address to show that churches are not free from the temptation either. For there is an inbuilt tension between the desire of leaders to lead a church on the right path and the need for renewal through the critical thinking of young people. In that respect, churches are in one boat with other religions and cultures. But they do not have to be. The anecdote from the beginning is an example that change is possible. When the Central African Republic was devastated by anarchic political violence in 2013 and 14, the Lutheran Church, together with others, played a remarkable role in relieving tension and calling people to reconciliation and peace. Together with Muslim leaders, bishops and church presidents traveled through the country and preached and taught that God does not want the death of people, neither in the Muslim nor in the Christian faith. They often were aggressed by their own members because of that message. In conclusion, let me use Fowler's comparison of the stories which form our lives, the narratives, with the river. We imagine a person who quietly sits in a small boat, floating on a river, together with many other people in other boats. Stage 2. At one moment, the transition, the person feels an impulsion to look at the river and the boats of all the others from another perspective and steers to the shore. From there, he or she gets a more distanced view of his or her background, motives, values. But the person stands on the shore with many others who come from the same river and did the same. They give the person the feeling of not being alone. Stage 3. Transition. At one point, though, the person will again feel the impulsion to move on, this time up to a hill where he or she can see many rivers, with many people standing on their shores. The person will realize that there are indeed many ways of life, many value systems, and that he or she will have to make choices. That is possible because the person walked on the mountain alone. Stage 4. That gives him or her a greater freedom of choice, but also a feeling of loneliness and increased responsibility. Such a person does not change every time. Rather, the person grows inwardly. Fowler is teaching us that the impulsion to move on comes quite naturally at the thresholds of the new phases of life, ideally at a certain age span in a person's life. The question is this: do the people in the other boats let the person go and steer to the shore? Or will they hold him or her back? Will those on the shore let the person go to the mountain or ostracize him or her? If he or she turns against the community, if this happens, growth is hindered. The best thing to happen is to be with leaders who encourage and even challenge young people to move on, and who do this in a friendly and caring manner. In my eyes, this is exactly what theological education is about. Fowler does not hide the fact that moving on is not always easy, but can be laden with fear. Moving on means disappointing others, the risk of being alone, and taking over responsibility. Much will depend on whether young people are encouraged by others who assure them that there is no reason to fear. Pastors assure their members, bishops assure their pastors, teachers assure their students that moving on is allowed. It is beneficial, and it is God's will. And isn't that the gospel in a nutshell? Do not fear. I thank you for your attention.